All right. 801. All right. So we've got lab this week, allelopathy. There's also wind dispersed diaspores. That is on the week after Thanksgiving, but you have time to produce your diaspores. So there's a handout. We'll discuss that handout in lab as well. Kind of give you the rules of that lab. Exam is Friday, so I'll have the practice problems, the population growth equations, those two homework problems. The key should be accessible, but I'll post my own key that shows how the work, how I answered the problems outside my office, so you can come check it out. The rest of the quizzes that are on Blackboard, they close tonight, 11:30. So you had 3 attempts to take them. If you still wanted to utilize, one of those attempts, you can. If you didn't do it and you want to take them to try to get at least some credit, it is with the late penalty. You have until 11:30 tonight to do it. After 11:30, all of the keys become live. So if you still don't know how to do it, how to access these keys, then come see me. All right, come see me, or you can probably ask your lecture instructor, how do you see the keys? They should all know, how to access, the quiz questions and the answers and so forth. And the exam's Friday, 8 a.m. I'll try to get here a little early. I'll have, if you're here, you want to start, you can start as soon as I get here. Bring a calculator. You will need it. All right? You will need it. And it's basically the same format as all the other exams. Any questions? No lab next week. We only have Monday and Tuesday. So we meet on Monday for lecture, and then we take a break until after Thanksgiving. We've got that 1 week before the exam, before the final. All right, let's start. So this is new material. This is material that'll be on the final exam. Final exam has about 25% new material on it. All right, so this is part of that new material. Because we're not quite done with life history strategies yet. We still have this reproductive patterns to talk about. Because life history is about growth and development. It's about our lifespan. It's about reproduction. Now, how do we reproduce? So we're going to start with that basic question. Is reproductive output always maximized? And this is something that you would think about it, and you would probably say, yeah, of course reproductive output is maximized, because if we increase reproductive output, we increase our fitness. And that statement is true. If you increase your reproductive output, you increase your fitness. But there's trade-offs associated with increasing reproductive output. And those trade-offs involve survivorship. So just because you start having more offspring doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be more fit, because it could come at a consequence of higher mortality rates, or in this case, lower survivorship. So if we increase our birth schedule, if we increase our reproductive output, we tend to decrease survivorship. Likewise, if we try to increase our survivorship, we tend to decrease our reproductive output. And you could say, well, I don't understand how this happens. Well, we just talked about increasing reproductive output. It comes at a cost. We're investing our energy towards reproduction at a cost of maintenance and growth. And that maintenance goes directly towards survivorship. So if we have less energy for maintenance, we're going to decrease our survivorship. Likewise, if we're going to invest more energy towards survival, towards our maintenance component, we're going to have less energy for our reproduction. And our reproduction is going to go down. So there's numerous examples of the cost of reproduction. Numerous examples that exist. And this is one. This figure is one. So we have a pied avocet. It's a bird. It's a bird. What they did, these researchers did, was they went to nests, found the birds, they laid the eggs in their nest, and then they artificially enlarged the nest size. All right, so they have basically, most birds lay, pretty consistent number of eggs. Pretty consistent. In some cases, they'll always lay 4 eggs, but then occasionally you'll get that one that lays 5 or lays 3 eggs, and so forth. So this is a pretty good example because you can go to the nest, you can count how many they laid, and then what you could do is take an egg from another nest and transplant it into one of your treatment nests. So what you've done is artificially increased the reproductive output to determine how does that affect overall success. So we have our control, our control nest. We have our enlarged nest, which is basically 1 egg. They added 1 more egg. So the blue, this first box, is after enlargement. Well, the control, they didn't enlarge. So you had 4 eggs that were there. And it stayed at 4 eggs after they did their enlargement. But the enlarged nest received 1 more egg. So it had started with 5. And then they looked at what's the success of those offspring. How many eggs hatched, and then how many of those hatchlings survived to fledge, which is basically they reach maturity and they leave the nest. Maybe not. Maturity might not be the best term, but they're old enough to where they can survive on their own, so they leave the nest. So what you see is you get this decrease initially. No big surprise. Not all eggs that are laid are going to hatch. Some of them take damage, some of them were infected, some of them may not have been fertilized. All right? This is a common occurrence, so you have the decrease. But the big difference was at fledging. So at 35 days, that control nest averaged 1 bird that fledged versus the enlarged nest that had less than 1. So here you have the situation where these offspring, not all of them will make it to leave the nest, will survive to leave the nest. And you'd think, well, if we add 1 more egg, we increase our chance that at least one of them survives, but in this case it doesn't, it decreases. So why is that? Well, how can we explain this decrease? Any guesses? I know, I think ornithology is in the spring, so probably haven't had this yet. Oh, maybe. It was offered 2 years ago. Some of you may have had to have it, or may have taken it 2 years ago. So why the decrease? Why did we have even fewer birds that fledged and are larger clutch sized? Any guess? Any of those at home have a guess? Yep. Increased clutch sizes, approaches carrying capacity. Good guess. not quite there. Our carrying capacity refers to our populations. So we're at the individual level on this. If we think about it, this would be more of an individual type of ecology. What does the parent bird have to do? What is the mama bird? What is her role in all of this? To bring back food. So mama bird goes out, forages, finds food, brings it back. Why does it bring it back? It's not a trick question. Why does it bring it back? Yeah, to feed the young, because the young aren't leaving the nest. They can't leave the nest and forage for themselves. So mama has to bring back all the food. What does having one more mouth to feed do to her? Anybody? More effort to find the food and bring it back. And if you think about this as saying, okay, mama bird's going out and expending all the energy to bring back food to feed for offspring, and now she has one more mouth. If she's already at her limit at finding food and bringing it back, she's not getting any more extra, which means each offspring then gets less food in this enlarged nest relative to each offspring in the control. So you have this parental investment. You had the increased offspring size. The parental investment goes out. They're capped out. She can't bring any more back. So all of the offspring start to suffer. And if they suffer, if they're not getting enough nutrients, enough energy, they might not survive to make it to that fledgling period. So when we talk about these trade-offs, it's not just the parent. It's not just the parent increases offspring and the parent's going to have a decreased survivorship. We also have to think about the effect on the offspring themselves. If we increase our reproductive output, what's going to be the cost to those offspring? How likely are they to survive? So we went through this one example for the cost of reproduction. A lot of it is tied to lost energy. If you increase your reproductive output, you have less energy available for growth and maintenance and so forth, but you also have increased mortality risk outside of that energy component. So, with this bird, if they forage and then she has to forage more just to meet the demands, she's exposing herself to predators. If you're out and you have to forage more, you're increasing your chance of injury and so forth. So we've got all of these trade-offs to consider. And lastly, our fitness, the fitness of the individual, is ultimately determined by the reproductive success of our offspring. If we reproduce and say, hey, congratulations, we succeeded. No. If we just reproduce and leave our offspring on the side of the road, they're not going to survive. And that's not good because our genes then end. Our genetic line ends with them. So our fitness is inherently tied to the reproductive success of our offspring. That's why that property of fitness, we have to measure it over more than one generation because we have to see it. How do our offspring do? Do they survive and reproduce? And if they do, that's good for us. Our fitness will be higher. All right, so remember these things as we move forward with reproduction. So what we're going to talk about with these strategies is a series of trade-offs. All right, they're not mutually exclusive, meaning we can't just talk about one set of trade-offs without considering their effect on other sets of trade-offs. So what we're going to talk about is parental investment. We're going to talk about number of reproductive events, and we're going to talk about age at maturity. All right, so our parental investment includes both our parental care, how much time and effort are we going to spend raising our young, but also how much energy do we invest in each individual offspring. So, and that's going to be related to the size of the offspring and the number of offspring that we have. So that's our parental investment. And then number of reproductive events is, should we reproduce once? Should we go for 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and so forth? And age at maturity, hopefully, is self-explanatory that we're going to try to figure out what's going to be the best age to start reproducing. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. We can't just look at parental investments without considering number of reproductive events and age at maturity. They're all going to be linked together because, again, fitness is being measured using that reproductive value curve. So we can have multiple combinations of these three things and have similar types of reproductive value curves and thus have this different variation. But if we change one aspect of it, we're going to change the curve. And if we change the curve, we'll likely cause a change in something else to try to offset that change, that decrease or that increase. So these things are not mutually exclusive, and I put this in red. Remember the principle of allocation. So as a quick review, what was our definition for the principle of allocation? And that was on exam number 1. So we've come back to this. I gave you two different things that we could say about principle of allocation. What's one definition? Anybody? So one is if we direct energy towards one component, then that energy is unavailable for other components. So that's one aspect of the principle of allocation. That's not how we use it for exam 1. How did we use it for exam 1? Did you find it yet? Yep. All right, so we had that. We're on a delay. Someone had exactly what I just said. If we extend that to the evolution of adaptations, so adapting to one selective force could preclude us from adapting to another force, another adaptive situation. Right? So if we're going to be really good at surviving high temperatures, it's going to probably come at a cost of having low survival in cold. All right? So that's this idea here. If we're going to adapt our life history strategy to focus on one aspect, it's probably not going to be very good at other aspects. All right, so we're going to start with parental investment. So parental investment is a total energy expenditure towards our offspring. The parental expenditure of energy on their offspring. Parental investment is not just parental care. I know a lot of people think that that's what it is, but that's not the only component. Because evolution has selected optimal sizes of our offspring and optimal clutch sizes, meaning how many we should have. So that is all parental care, because if we're going to produce offspring, we are directing energy towards the production of those offspring. And then parental care is that second aspect of, we've already directed energy towards producing the offspring. Now we're directing additional energy towards the care of those offspring. So all of that falls under parental investment. So parental care includes feeding and defense of offspring. Size of the offspring, it should be self-explanatory. How big should our offspring be when they're born? and the number of offspring that we should have every time we reproduce. Should we have, a bunch of offspring? Should we just do one, one at a time? That's all that is all parental investment. So how we choose to allocate our energy will have an effect on our offspring. And that was kind of 2 slides ago with that example. If we had one more offspring in our nest, that incurred a cost to all of our offspring. So for here, the example that I give is big versus small offspring. We can invest a lot of energy to have a big offspring when they're born, and that can favor them. But if you're going to have a big offspring, that means they're going to demand more energy post-birth, and we're probably going to spend more time foraging and providing for that young. And it could come at a cost of limiting how many offspring we can care for. If we do small offspring, yeah, you could say we cheaped out. We didn't spend as much energy on that one offspring, and thus they're smaller. But now we have more offspring available, or more energy available to perhaps have 2 or 3 offspring. Or we have more time now to forage and do things for our own life, for our own survival, and not just our offspring. So there's going to be cost associated with our allocation strategy. All right. Ready? So we're going to start with the size versus number of offspring. This is kind of a bigger one, and this represents a major trade-off for reproduction. So we can have large offspring at the cost of producing fewer of them, or we could produce small offspring and produce a lot of them. Now, I presented it as having large versus small, but we could also do the number. We could choose to produce 1 offspring and make them big, or we can choose to produce many offspring, but the cost now is that they're going to be smaller and what we would call low-quality offspring. All right, so what's the benefit of producing a large offspring at birth? Usually they're considered higher quality. They're considered higher quality, and that quality is in reference to they're going to have more of their systems developed, maybe a better developed immune system. They're usually going to be better competitors because they're going to be more fully developed. They might be able to forage earlier in life, and thus if they can forage, they're going to outcompete those who need more parental care later in life. So overall, these larger offspring, if you compare a large offspring versus a smaller offspring, the larger offspring tends to have a fitness advantage, and that's a good thing. But if you're going to produce one of these larger offspring, you're not going to be able to produce many of them. So if one of those offspring, if they're born during a year that's just uncharacteristically bad, you could say weather-wise, or a bad disturbance or something like that, and that offspring dies because of that, you just got unlucky. That one offspring that you produced, they're gone. You have to either wait to the next reproductive period, maybe that next year, or if you're in a species that reproduces once, that's it. You had your shot. So larger offspring, yeah, better quality, better competitors. But you're producing fewer of them, which means you're going to be more likely to lose all of them in a chance event, in a random stochastic event. Now, if you're concerned about losing all of them, one strategy then is to produce a whole lot of offspring. Because if you have a lot of offspring and you have one of these major weather events go through, you've got a lot of chances to survive that one event. And your hope is that at least 1 or 2 of them actually survive it. Probability of success may only be 1% chance of survival. But if you have 100 individuals, 100 offspring, you're going to expect or average 1 individual surviving. And that's all it takes for you to get your genes to that next generation. So with a lot of offspring, yeah, you've got the probability of losing all of them all at once is pretty low. You're going to have at least one normally survive. But the cost of this is that we can't invest in large offspring. We've already invested in producing a whole lot of offspring. Now, each of those offspring are going to be small. We're going to call them low quality because they're not going to be as competitive as larger individuals. Lower quality, poor competitors. Get these? So large offspring versus fewer, large offspring and fewer of them, or smaller offspring and a whole lot of them. And we'll come back to some of these overall strategies. Parental care. So this is after we're born, or after the offspring are born. How much energy should the parent direct towards care of their offspring? And the care would be defense of their offspring, it would be nutrition of their offspring, basically anything that helps get those offspring to reach reproductive maturity. This is often a good thing, especially when we have low chance of survival earlier in life. Parental care can increase survival rates. And early in life, that is usually our period of highest mortality, excluding when we reach our lifespan, right? When we reach our lifespan, we're not living to 200 years old at that point. So what we're doing with this parental care is trying to increase the chance that our offspring can survive to reproductive maturity. And there are also trade-offs with this. And we started alluding to these. So one of them was the number of offspring that we can have. If we're going to provide food and defense to these offspring, there's going to be an upper limit as to how many we can actually care for. If we can't care for all of the offspring, then, and we still try to provide even distribution, equitable distribution of food and defense to all of them, well, we just caused increased mortality for each of those offspring. And that's equitable distribution. If we find out that, hey, we can't care for all of these mouths, parent might say, you know what, the smallest one, you're out of luck. I'm going to kick you out of the nest so that I can care for these 4. Still lose one offspring. So there is upper limit to how many offspring we can care for. That's a selective force. But we also have to consider the activity that are lost as the parents are caring for their young. Because if we're going to provide defense, if we're going to provide nutrition, that's less energy available for us to do things that we might want to do. So for the birds, if they mate and they're caring for their young in the nest, they're foraging for those individuals. You're going to be sacrificing some of your energy, some of the nutrients that you would have naturally caught and consumed to provide to the young. So your body mass is probably going to decrease. Your body mass decreases, your body could get stressed. Your stress levels go up, your susceptibility to diseases go up. All right, so part of this, you increase mortality rates of the parents through, lost energy for them. But also, they're spending all of their time foraging for their young. They don't have time to do things for them, which could be trying to find another mate. Lost mating activity, maybe you're not defending your territory as much. You're allowing others to encroach in your area. So trade-offs exist, a lot of them exist with this parental care. Ready? All right, number of reproductive events. So we talked about parental care. Now we're talking about how many times should we reproduce through our life. So if we reproduce once, and that's it, this is called semelparity, or semmelparous reproduction. So it's going to be a strategy where we reproduce one time in our life. If we're going to reproduce one time in our life, then we probably want to maximize the number of offspring that we have. So in many cases, when organisms exhibit this semelparous reproduction, we typically call it big bang reproduction because they survive, they invest their energy to growth and development, and then as soon as they get to that point where it's like, I'm going to reproduce, it's all out reproduction. That's it. We're going to reproduce, we're going to produce a huge number of offspring, or we're going to try to produce as many offspring as we can, as, let's say, physics determines we can have. This type of reproduction is exhibited under various circumstances. So one time in which this type of reproduction is exhibited is when the cost of reproduction is very high. When the cost of reproduction is high, you tend to only get one type of reproduction, or one time of reproduction throughout your life, and thus you're going to exhibit this type of reproductive pattern. Salmon are a great example. Pacific salmon. They don't reproduce until they come back to their river. And we know that these salmon tend to come back to the same rivers from which they were born, in which they were born. That migration up the river is very, very costly to the individual. So costly, but by the time they get up, they're going to die shortly thereafter. So the salmon pattern is to basically survive out in the ocean until they feel like they're big enough and strong enough to make that very costly migration into fresh water. And once they make that migration, that's it. They're going to start, they're going to get up there, they're going to reproduce, and that's one time. That's it. They reproduce one time. It's our big bang reproduction. So if the cost of reproduction is very, very high, where you reproduce and you are extremely unlikely to reproduce again, yeah, semelparity, this big bang reproduction, that's going to be a strategy that is favored. I guess that covers number 2, low survival of the adult. So yeah, normally if reproduction is very costly, right, your chance of surviving to that next reproductive period is going to be low. And if it doesn't look like we're going to survive, we better reproduce now. It goes back to that VX curve, right? It weighs current reproduction versus future reproduction, or future prospects of reproduction. So if survival, your chance of surviving to that next reproduction is low, we should invest in reproducing now. But if it looks like we can survive to that next reproductive period at a high frequency, high probability, we can wait. We can wait to reproduce and reproduce at that later time if we're going to be able to be more successful with our reproduction. So, semelparity is exhibited when reproductive cost is high, when our chance of surviving to the next reproductive period is very, very low. And the other time is when we have very high mortality rates among the juvenile and larvae. So in this case, we have very high mortality rates. The chance of each offspring surviving to reproductive maturity could be less than 0.1%. And if it's less than 0.1%, then we better have a whole lot of offspring to try to guarantee that at least some of them survive. So we think about fish, you can think about frogs and stuff. They have a lot of offspring. Why is that? Well, you see a lot of tadpoles. You can find a lot of tadpoles. They might have all come from one frog, but not all of them will ever make it out of that pond. Actually, very few of them will make it out of that pond, and even less of them will make it to reproduction. So when we have this juvenile mortality rates being very high, we increase our reproductive output. Because again, we're hoping that at least some of them can survive. This is also correlated with minimal parental investment. So again, we talked about if you're going to produce a lot of offspring, you don't have the energy, you don't have the time to take care of every single one of them. So in these organisms, you don't really see a whole lot of parental investment. You don't see much of it at all. This sounds good for all of these situations, but they all come at cost, or they all come with cost. And that cost is we're reproducing one time. That's it. If we get up to that river and all of a sudden we go through a drought and it dries, that's it. That's it. We made our offspring, none of them survive, we lose. So if the conditions are poor, this type of reproduction has the risk of complete failure during those times. Now for the species, we're just hoping that not all individuals reproduce at the same time. Hopefully they're staggered. So let's say maybe a third of the individuals reproduce this year, a third next year, and a third the year after that. Now we're kind of buffering that uncertainty, that variability in our weather conditions that might produce a reproductive failure in any one year. So that's similarity. Reproduce one time, also called Big Bang reproduction, because they're producing large numbers of offspring. The other end of the spectrum is heteroparity. So heteroparity, or heteroparous reproduction, is a reproductive strategy in which females reproduce more than once in their lifetime. So simiparous, once and that's it. Heteroparous, you can reproduce more than one time, and you actually try to reproduce more than one time. Not only try, but you usually do reproduce more than one time. You have more than one reproductive periods. When do we exhibit this? It's usually exhibited when reproduction isn't very costly to the individual. So if we stop what we're doing to go reproduce, try to find a mate, reproduce, and so forth, if that cost isn't very high, if our mortality increase isn't very high, we can risk doing this several times during our life. And that applies to the parents, that also applies to the offspring as well. So after the offspring are born, if we can manage to care for them and it doesn't incur a significant risk to mortality, it allows us then to have more offspring at later periods in our life. The other aspect is that risk of survival or the risk of mortality between our reproductive periods. So we talked about similarity and said that if it's unlikely we would make it to that next reproduction period, we should probably invest all of our energy towards reproduction at that one time, get it done, because we're not likely to have another chance at it. That's different from heteroparity. If we have a high chance of surviving to that next reproduction, we can wait. Or we can reproduce now and then reproduce later on in life because we should have that opportunity. If we choose this type of reproductive pattern, it's going to allow us to invest energy in other aspects of our offspring. So instead of investing all of our energy into the number of offspring because we get one shot at it, we can start to invest more energy in our offspring to increase the chances that they can get to maturity. So things that we can do is to decrease our clutch size, have fewer offspring, but then produce bigger offspring, higher quality offspring. So we've invested in quality of the offspring, and if we're going to invest in quality of the offspring, then we're going to do that next step and invest in parental care to try to help them after they're born to get to maturity. Reproductive failure is possible still. But now, since we've spread out our reproduction over multiple years or multiple time periods, it's going to be less likely that we have complete and total reproductive failure. We can have a bad year. We might not be able to reproduce in that year, or if we reproduce, we might lose our offspring that year. But we have another chance at it. We can do it. We can mate and reproduce that next year or the year after that. And hopefully at that time, conditions are better. And they allow our offspring then to survive. And perhaps if it's a good year, our offspring really do survive quite well. They get big. They have good offspring and everything, and that helps us with our fitness. This last point goes back and ties into simulparous reproduction. And you can kind of call it a trade-off between the two. If we take this heteroparous reproduction, this type of strategy, we're going to probably have one or a few offspring that make it to maturity. And that's a good thing. We accomplished what we were doing. Evolutionarily, we got to that point. That's what we needed. But we're not going to have hundreds of thousands. We can't. We're not producing that many offspring. But simulparous reproduction, if they happen to reproduce in a good year, in a good location, you might see tens to hundreds survive. And that's just phenomenal for that individual because, again, if our fitness is tied to how many offspring actually make it to reproduction and reproduce, and we've got now 100, we're going to have a much, much higher fitness than that individual who only had one individual survive, one offspring survive. So there's kind of trade-offs, but you kind of have to look back to say, well, how likely is it that we'll have 100 to 1,000 offspring survive through this simulparous reproduction? It's not very good. It's not very good. Normally, we're producing about the same number of offspring at reproductive maturity between the simulparous and heteroparous reproduction. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to take our quiz, and I think we're going to stop here at age of maturity. So, our attendance quiz. In honor of Clue, which incidentally auditions for the local production of Clue is today. And no, you won't see me out there. But where did it happen? Happened in either the study or the library. So those are your two answers, study or library. Study and library, those are our two answers. We're going to finish this presentation up on Wednesday, and then there's a quiz tied to it, but I'm not going to make the quiz due until probably Tuesday of Thanksgiving week. So that way you can focus on your exam on Friday, and then after the exam, review your notes and get this done. All right, so 2 quiz answers, study and library. All right. Y'all have a good one.